Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was the only survivor of Sokovia and recruited by the Avengers? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in Novigrad tasted of sweet pastry and diesel fumes, a strange but not unpleasant combination that Izuku Midoriya was meticulously cataloging in a fresh, crisp notebook. Its cover was a plain, unassuming black, but inside, its pages were already filling with his spidery, frantic handwriting. This was notebook number 14, though the first of its kind. Hero Analysis for the Future, European Edition. He sat at a small, wrought iron table outside a bustling Sokovian cafe, the cheerful yellow awning offering a sliver of shade from the mild spring sun. Across from him, his mother, Inko, watched him with a familiar, fond exasperation. "Izuku, honey, your crumpeta will melt if you just stare at it," she said, her Japanese lilting softly in the Eastern European air. She gestured with her fork towards the pristine cube of custard and flaky pastry on his plate. "I'm documenting," Izuku mumbled, not looking up. His pen scratched furiously. The local hero, Straza, just stopped a purse snatching across the square. Her power seems to be a form of limited, localized kinetic redirection. She didn't absorb the runner's momentum, she deflected it, causing him to trip over his own feet. It's subtle, not flashy, but highly effective for crowd control and non-lethal takedowns. Low collateral damage potential. Very efficient. Hisashi Midoriya, his father, chuckled from beside Inko. He lowered his newspaper, a copy of the Sokovian Herald, its headlines a mix of local news and rising political tensions with its neighbors. "Let him be, Inko. It's not every day we get to see a real-life European hero in action. Better than those flashy American ones, right, son?" Izuku's head snapped up, his green eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and indignation. "The Avengers aren't just flashy, Dad. Iron Man's suit is a marvel of engineering, a perfect synergy of hardware and a brilliant user interface. And Captain America's combat style incorporates his shield in a way that's both offensive and defensive with a geometric precision that's almost impossible to predict. I have a whole notebook just on his ricochet calculations." All right, Professor Midoriya," Hisashi laughed, raising his hands in surrender. He had a kind face, softened by the faintest lines of age around his eyes, and the same unruly green-black hair as his son. "I yield. My work on Stark Industries' atmospheric purifiers pales in comparison." "It does not," Izuku said, his cheeks flushing. "Your work is important. You're helping people. That's what heroes do." His father's smile was warm and genuine. It was a rare treat, having him here. For the past 2 years, Hisashi's work as a top-tier engineer had stationed him here in Sokovia, a part of a Stark Industries outreach program meant to build infrastructure and goodwill. The pay was phenomenal, but the distance was a chasm. This 2-week trip, a chance for the family to be whole again under one roof, felt like a miracle. Inko reached across the table and brushed a stray curl from Izuku's forehead. Her own expression was softer, but a persistent worry crease was etched between her brows. "I'm just glad we're all together. This place, it makes me nervous, Hisashi. The news is always talking about protests, about foreign interference. It's just political posturing, my love," Hisashi said, folding his paper. He pointed to a pair of sleek, white and blue androids patrolling the far side of the square. They were Stark's Iron Legion, a common sight in the city. Stark's peacekeeping initiative has done wonders. People feel safer. Business is improving. This is the future. Inko followed his gaze, but her expression didn't relax. "They look like his toys. What happens when the batteries run out?" Izuku, meanwhile, had already flipped to a new page. He was sketching the Iron Legion drone, adding notes in the margins. "Primary function, crowd control and surveillance. Non-lethal ordnance. Repulsor-based flight similar to MK. 3 armor but less powerful. Vulnerable joints? Query, can their programming be compromised? What are the firewalls like?" He was quirkless. The word had been a brand on his soul since he was 4 years old, a clinical, soul-crushing diagnosis that had reshaped his entire world. In a society where 80% of the population had some kind of superpower, He was a statistical anomaly, a throwback. But where his body had failed, his mind had overcompensated. He couldn't lift a car or breathe fire, but he could dissect the powers of those who could with a frighteningly accurate perception. His notebooks were his life's work, a desperate attempt to participate in a world of heroes from the sidelines. Izuku, Inko said, her voice gentle but firm this time. Eat. He finally relented, setting his pen down and picking up his fork. The crumpeta was heavenly, a cloud of vanilla custard that melted on his tongue. For a moment, he wasn't quirkless Izuku or the obsessive analyst. He was just a 14-year-old boy, sitting in a foreign city with the two people he loved most in the world. The sun was warm, the pastry was sweet, and the low hum of the city was a comforting thrum. It was perfect. He didn't know it was the last perfect moment he would ever have. 1 week later, the perfection had fractured. The air had grown thick with tension, the way it does before a thunderstorm. The cheerful hum of the city had been replaced by the angry shouts of protesters in the main square. Hisashi had been called into work at the Stark facility on the edge of town, an all-hands-on-deck emergency that he couldn't explain. It's just a system-wide diagnostic, he'd said over the phone, his voice strained. Some new global defense network Mr. Stark is rolling out. I'll be home late. Lock the doors, stay inside, and I love you both. I love you too, Inko had replied, her knuckles white where she gripped the phone. Be safe. Love you, Dad, Izuku had echoed from the living room of their small, temporary apartment. Now, hours later, the shouting outside had turned to screams. It started with an explosion, a deep, guttural boom that rattled the window panes and sent a flock of pigeons scattering into the sky. Izuku and Inko rushed to the window, peering down at the chaos unfolding 5 stories below. The Iron Legion drones were no longer patrolling. They were attacking. Beams of blue energy lanced into the crowd, turning a protest into a massacre. From the center of the city, a voice echoed, amplified by some unseen force. It was metallic, resonant, and dripping with a chilling, theatrical contempt. I know you're good people, it declared. I know you mean well. But you just didn't think it through. There is only one path to peace. Your extinction. Izuku's analytical mind desperately tried to catch up with the terror flooding his senses. Whose voice is that? A new villain? A terrorist group that seized the drones? The programming shouldn't be that easy to hack. The firewalls. Then the ground began to shake. It wasn't the tremor of an earthquake. It was a low, grinding groan, the sound of a mountain being tortured. A car alarm blared, then abruptly silenced as a crack raced across the street below, wide enough to swallow it whole. The apartment building shuddered violently, and a framed family photo, the 3 of them smiling at a festival in Japan, tumbled from the wall and shattered on the floor. Izuku! Get away from the window! Inko shrieked, pulling him back. Her face was a mask of pure terror. We have to get out. Now! She grabbed his hand, her palms slick with sweat, and pulled him towards the door. The hallway was chaos. People were screaming, crying, pushing their way towards the stairwell. The building groaned again, tilting at a sickening angle. Izuku felt a wave of vertigo, his stomach lurching as the floor slanted beneath his feet. They joined the desperate exodus, swept along in a current of human panic. The stairwell was a concrete throat choked with terrified bodies. An old woman stumbled, and Izuku automatically reached out to help her, but he was too small, too weak, and the crowd simply surged over her. He saw a flash of her terrified eyes before she was gone. The metallic voice returned, a calm sermon over the symphony of destruction. Upon this rock I will build my church. They burst out of the building's ground floor into a nightmare. The sky was wrong. Chunks of debris, cars, lampposts, pieces of other buildings, were drifting upwards. Izuku looked down the street and saw the edge. An actual, physical edge where the city just ended, revealing a chasm of churning dirt and rock beneath. His mind finally put the pieces together, and the conclusion was so impossible, so insane, that he almost laughed. Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling. The city. The whole city, it's flying. Inko didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were scanning the sky, searching for a savior. For Iron Man. For any of them. But the sky was filled only with more of the rogue drones, their blue energy beams crisscrossing the rising cityscape like a spider's web. Hisashi. Inko breathed, fumbling for her phone. She dialed his number, her fingers shaking so badly it took 3 tries. It went straight to a recorded message. Hisashi, please answer me. A shadow fell over them. Izuku looked up and saw it, a massive figure, 8 feet tall, crafted from gleaming metal. It wasn't an Iron Legion drone. It was something else. Something new. Its face was a cruel parody of a human's, with articulated plates that shifted as it spoke, the source of the terrible voice. Stark's legacy, the robot sneered, its glowing red eyes fixing on them. Frightened children, cowering in the ruins. Behind it, a section of an office building, torn from its foundation, began to topple in their direction. It moved in a horrifying slow motion, a mountain of steel and glass descending to crush them. Izuku! Inko's scream was primal. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. In that final, terrible second, she threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around her son and turning her back to the falling debris. Her body was a shield, small and fragile against the avalanche of concrete. Stay with me, Izuku, she whispered into his hair, her voice tight with a love so fierce it defied the apocalypse around them. Close your eyes. It's going to be okay. Mommy's here. Time seemed to warp. Izuku was pressed against his mother's chest, her heart beat a frantic drum against his ear. He could hear the whistle of the falling building, the grinding roar of its descent. He could smell the dust and her perfume. He could feel her arms, an iron band of love and desperation around him. He was 14 years old. He was quirkless. He couldn't save the old woman in the stairs. He couldn't save his father. And now he was going to die, listening to his mother's final lie that everything would be okay. The grief was a physical thing, a white-hot spear that lanced through his chest. It was a grief for his father, who was probably already gone. A grief for his mother, who was about to be obliterated to save him for a fraction of a second. A grief for himself, for the hero he would never become, for the life he would never live. All of it, the analysis, the notebooks, the dreams, it was all just a pathetic fantasy. The weight of the world, a literal mountain of rubble, was coming down to extinguish them. The unfairness of it all, the sheer, cosmic cruelty, ignited the grief into a boundless rage. No, the thought wasn't even his. It was a primal instinct, a denial scream from the very core of his being. No, darkness. The pressure was immense, unimaginable. He felt his bones begin to creak, his lungs straining for air that wasn't there. His mother's embrace was the only thing anchoring him to reality. And then, her grip loosened. The frantic drumming of her heart against his ear stopped. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. In that silent, crushing void, something inside Izuku Midoriya snapped. The grief, the rage, the terror, the love, every powerful, overwhelming emotion he had ever felt, converged into a single, blinding point of energy deep within his solar plexus. The years of being told he was empty, a void, a zero, it was all a lie. There had been something there all along. It had been sleeping. And now, at the end of all things, it had awoken. It demanded release. A scream tore from his throat, but it was soundless, lost in the pressure. It was a scream of pure, undiluted agony. And with it, the energy erupted. Green lightning, incandescent and alive, burst from his body. It wasn't a quirk. It was a cataclysm. The light was blinding, a verdant supernova in the suffocating dark. It didn't just push the debris away, it unmade it. Ton-heavy slabs of concrete and twisted steel rebar were vaporized into fine dust, atomized by a force that defied physics. The green energy formed a perfect sphere around him, a 5-foot bubble of absolute destruction that carved a hollow space within the mountain of rubble. The burst lasted only a second, but it consumed everything. It consumed the rubble. It consumed his grief. It consumed the last of his strength. The green light faded. The roar of the explosion was replaced by an echoing silence. He was lying in a small, spherical cavern of his own making, the walls of compacted dust glowing with a faint, residual green energy. He was alive. He pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. His arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and a sharp pain radiated from his leg. But he didn't care. "Mom?" he rasped, his voice raw. He looked down. Inko Midoriya lay beside him, untouched by the rubble. But her body was still. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, a stark contrast to the terror that had been there moments before. The force of the collapse, the initial impact before his power had flared, had been instantaneous. She was gone. He had survived. He was alive, and she was not. The power, the miracle that had saved him, had been a fraction of a second too late to save her. Izuka crawled to her side, his vision blurring with tears. He laid his head on her chest, praying to hear the frantic drumbeat from before. He prayed for a breath, a twitch, anything. There was only silence. The profound, empty silence of the grave he had inadvertently dug for them both. He didn't scream again. He didn't have the strength. He just lay there, his broken body curled next to his mother's lifeless one, as the green glow in the cavern slowly faded, plunging him into an absolute, suffocating darkness. His consciousness frayed, the pain and the grief pulling him under. The last thing he saw, seared into his memory, was the gentle, peaceful curve of his mother's cheek. Then nothing. Defeat tasted like ash and smelled of ozone. Captain Steve Rogers stood on the edge of the newly made crater, his shield strapped to his back. The battle was over. Ultron was gone, Vision had seen to that. But this was no victory. Below him lay the pulverized remains of Novigrad, a gaping wound in the earth. It was a graveyard, and he was one of its architects. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the heavy cloak of failure. He could still hear the screams. He knew they would be the soundtrack to his nightmares for years to come. "Anything?" he asked into his comms, his voice flat. "Negative, Cap," came Sam Wilson's tired reply. Scoured the entire perimeter. Nothing. Not even a stray dog. "Same here," Clint Barton added, his voice strained. "Place is a tomb." Steve clenched his jaw. He had ordered the evacuation. He had fought to save every life he could. But Ultron had been faster. More thorough. He took a breath, trying to filter the stench of pulverized rock and death from his lungs. His enhanced senses were a curse in moments like these. He could hear every gust of wind whistling through the wreckage, every distant pebble skittering down the crater's edge. He could hear the thrum of Tony's suit as he hovered over the epicenter, running scans. And he could hear. Steve froze. He tilted his head, concentrating, filtering out the other sounds. There. It was impossibly faint, a delicate thump-thump, thump-thump, hidden beneath meters of crushed earth and rock. A heartbeat. It was slow, weak, and fluttering, but it was undeniably there. "Tony," Steve said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the calm's chatter. "I've got something. Center of the impact zone, about 50 meters north of your position. I'm hearing a heartbeat." There was a moment of silence on the line before Tony's voice came back, stripped of its usual bravado. "Steve, that's impossible. Friday's scans are showing 0 life signs. Nothing biological." "Your scanner's wrong," Steve insisted, already starting to scramble down the steep incline of the crater. "I hear it. It's weak, but it's there. I'm going in." He navigated the treacherous terrain with practiced ease, his boots finding purchase on slabs of concrete the size of cars. As he got closer to the source, another sound reached him, the low, crackling hum of residual energy. Tony's suit landed beside him in a quiet whisper of thrusters, a stark contrast to his usual bombastic arrivals. The gold and red faceplate retracted, revealing Tony Stark's haggard, grease-smeared face. The guilt was carved into every line of his expression. His eyes, usually dancing with wit and arrogance, were haunted. "Friday, run a deep-level bioscan. Focus on auditory anomalies," Tony commanded, his voice barely a whisper. He knelt, placing a gauntlet hand on the ground. "There's a weird energy signature here. Tachyons of all things. Fading fast, but..." A holographic display shimmered to life in front of Tony's face. A moment later, his eyes widened. "Sir," Friday's calm, feminine voice reported, "Captain Rogers is correct. I am detecting a single, faint human heartbeat, tachycardic and arrhythmic. It is shielded by an anomalous energy field that was interfering with my initial wideband scans. Life signs are critical. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Steve's exhaustion. Where? Tony pointed to a massive pile of rubble directly in front of them, a compressed hill of what used to be an apartment complex. In there. Deep. Without another word, they went to work. Steve grabbed the edge of a colossal concrete slab, his muscles straining as he heaved it aside. Tony used targeted, low-power repulsor blasts to disintegrate smaller pieces of debris, clearing a path with surgical precision. For once, their two methods, brute strength and advanced technology, worked in perfect, desperate harmony. They dug for 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. The heartbeat on Tony's display grew stronger, more stable, as they cleared the immense weight above it. Then they saw it, a faint, pulsing green light, emanating from a crack in the compacted earth. Easy, Tony, Steve cautioned, moving to his hands and knees. He began clearing the remaining rubble by hand, piece by piece, as gently as he could. As the opening widened, the source of the light was revealed. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 14 or 15, with a mop of dark green hair caked with dust and blood. He was curled in a fetal position, half draped over the body of a woman. His clothes were torn, one arm was twisted at a gruesome angle, and a web of angry purple bruises and deep cuts covered his visible skin. He was horrifically injured, but he was breathing, and he was glowing. Faint, ethereal streams of green energy, the same color as his hair, pulsed from his body, wrapping around him like a protective shroud. Steve reached in, his hands gentle as he checked for a pulse on the boy's neck. It was there, thready and weak, but undeniably present. He then checked the woman. There was nothing. Her body was cold. Tony Stark stood frozen, his face a canvas of utter horror and disbelief. He had created Ultron. He had built the weapon that had done this. He had seen death on a massive scale all day, but this one, singular, impossible survivor, a child broken amidst the ruins of his hubris, was infinitely worse. It was personal. It was an accusation. Steve carefully gathered the boy into his arms. He was lighter than he should have been, a fragile collection of broken bones. As he lifted him from the rubble, the green glow around the boy flickered then died, as if its duty was done. He's alive, Steve breathed, the words feeling holy and profane in the vast emptiness of the crater. Get the Quinjet prepped. Chose best equipment. Now, Tony. Tony didn't respond. He just stared at the child in Steve's arms, his gaze fixed on the boy's dust-covered face. He looked so young. So small. A single, impossible spark of life in a city of ghosts. His calm crackled to life. It was Natasha. Steve? Tony? What's going on? We saw you digging. Tony finally tore his eyes away, looking up at the gray, indifferent sky that had been their battlefield. He keyed his own calm, his voice hollow, brittle, and haunted by the weight of a million dead souls and the one that had, against all odds, refused to join them. We found someone, he said, the words barely audible. A boy. He's alive. There was a stunned silence on the calm line, broken only by Friday's clear, dispassionate voice, delivering the final, soul-crushing confirmation that would forever define their victory. Sir, I have completed the final sweep. Scans confirm 0 other biological life signs within the crater. The message hung in the air. 0 other life signs. The sole survivor of Sokovia was a broken Japanese boy in Captain America's arms, and he was Tony Stark's living, breathing failure. The first thing to return was the beeping. It was a soft, rhythmic chime, a gentle counterpoint to the roaring silence in his head. It was clean, sterile, and utterly indifferent. For a time, that was all his universe consisted of, the chime, and the oppressive, crushing darkness behind his eyelids. Then came the smell. Antiseptic. A sharp, chemical cleanliness that scrubbed the air of all other scents. It smelled like the nurse's office at his junior high, but purer, more concentrated. It was the smell of healing, but it carried no comfort. It only served to highlight the absence of other, more familiar scents, the faint, earthy smell of his mother's potted plants, the rich aroma of his father's morning coffee, the sweet, dusty scent of old paper from his notebooks. He was adrift in a sensory void, anchored only by a sound and a smell. He tried to grasp for a memory, for something solid, but his thoughts were slippery, like trying to catch water in his hands. He could feel the edges of a great and terrible thing, a memory so vast and sharp it threatened to shred his consciousness if he touched it directly. Green light, the weight of the world, a frantic drumbeat against his ear, and then, silence. A gasp, thin and reedy, escaped his lips. The sensation of his own breath was a shock. It was followed by a symphony of pain, a dull, throbbing ache in his left arm, a sharp, grinding fire in his right leg, and a deep, cavernous emptiness in his chest that hurt more than all the broken bones combined. His eyelids were heavy, sealed shut with the grit of sleep and something more. He forced them open. The world swam into focus in a blur of painful, brilliant white. A white ceiling, composed of smooth, seamless panels. White walls, devoid of any decoration. White sheets, tucked tightly around him. He was in a bed, a strange one that felt both soft and unyieldingly firm. Wires and tubes snaked from his body, tethering him to a bank of glowing, silent monitors that displayed his vitals in cool blue and green lines. A clear tube was taped to the back of his hand, feeding a steady drip of fluid into his veins. This wasn't a Sokovian hospital. It wasn't a Japanese hospital. He didn't know where he was. He tried to push himself up, but a jolt of agony shot through his left arm, which was encased in a sleek, black cast from his wrist to his shoulder. He fell back against the pillows, another pained gasp escaping him. Easy now. Don't try to move too much. The voice was female, calm, and professional, with a faint Korean accent. A woman came into his field of vision, her face framed by a short, neat bob of dark hair. She wore a pristine white lab coat and offered him a small, sympathetic smile. Her name tag read Dr. Helen Cho. You're awake, she said, her eyes flicking to the monitors. That's good. Your vitals are stabilizing faster than we anticipated. You gave us quite a scare. Izuku stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and rising panic. He opened his mouth to ask the thousand questions screaming in his head. Where am I? What happened? Where are my parents? But no sound came out. His throat was a knot of stone, the muscles refusing to obey. The terror of it, the sudden inability to even form a word, sent a fresh spike of fear through him. Dr. Cho seemed to notice his distress. It's all right. Your vocal cords are strained, and you're suffering from severe psychological shock. It's not uncommon to experience temporary mutism after such a trauma. Just listen for now. Can you understand me? Blink once for yes. He blinked. The simple action felt monumental. Good, she said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. My name is Dr. Helen Cho. You're in the medical wing of the new Avengers compound in upstate New York. You were brought here after the incident in Sokovia. Sokovia. The name was a key, unlocking the floodgates. The memories came rushing back, not as a coherent narrative, but as a maelstrom of horrific snapshots. The screaming robot. The rising city, the falling building. His mother's embrace. The green light. The silence. The emptiness in his chest became a physical chasm. He could feel a scream building, a raw, primal howl of grief, but it died in his throat, trapped behind the wall of silence. His breathing hitched, turning into ragged, soundless sobs. The monitors beside him began to chime faster, their steady rhythm breaking into a frantic alarm. It's okay, Dr. Cho said quickly, her voice a soothing balm. Breathe with me. Just breathe. She placed a cool hand on his forehead, and to his surprise, the simple human contact helped to anchor him, pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. After a few moments, his breathing steadied, and the alarms quieted. You sustained extensive injuries, Dr. Cho continued, choosing her words carefully. Multiple compound fractures in your left arm and right leg. A collapsed lung, severe internal bruising and a significant subdural hematoma. Frankly, Izuku, she said, using his name for the first time, by all medical logic, you shouldn't have survived the initial trauma, let alone the trip here. She gestured to a large, arch-like machine that stood retracted against the far wall. This is the regeneration cradle. It uses synthetic tissue printing to heal injuries at an accelerated rate. We've had you in it for nearly 72 hours. It saved your life. She paused, a thoughtful, almost puzzled look on her face. But even the cradle isn't this effective. Your own cellular regeneration is remarkable. Off the charts, actually. Your body is healing itself at a rate I've never witnessed. Izuku barely heard her scientific assessment. His mind was stuck on a single, horrifying loop. He had survived. Against all odds, he was alive and healing. But what about? He looked at her, his eyes wide and pleading, trying to force the silent question out through sheer willpower. My parents? Where are my parents? Dr. Cho's professional mask wavered, a flicker of deep sadness crossing her features. She knew the question he was asking. The Avengers, they want to speak with you when you're ready, she said evasively, her voice soft. Just rest for now. Your body has been through an ordeal. We need to let it recover. She checked his adjusted a setting on one of the monitors, and then quietly left the room, leaving Izuku alone once more with the sterile white walls and the deafening, rhythmic chime of his own life. He knew she was hiding something. The pity in her eyes was an answer in itself, an answer so terrible he couldn't bear to look at it directly. So he closed his eyes and let the darkness take him again, seeking a refuge that no longer existed. When he woke again, he was not alone. The first thing he saw was a mountain of a man standing near the foot of his bed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair and a face that looked like it was carved from granite and kindness. He recognized him instantly. It was Captain America. He wore simple civilian clothes, a plain blue Henley and beige pants, but he carried himself with an unmistakable aura of authority and strength. Izuku flinched, a full-body recoil that sent a fresh jolt of pain through his limbs. His mind flashed with an image of that star-spangled shield, hurtling through the chaos of Sokovia, a symbol of the battle that had torn his world apart. The man, Steve Rogers, saw the flinch and immediately took a half-step back, raising his hands in a gentle, placating gesture. Easy, son. It's okay. We're not going to hurt you. His voice was warm and deep, like a steady campfire on a cold night. But it offered no comfort. Another man stepped forward from the corner of the room. He was slighter, with curly dark hair, glasses, and a nervous energy about him. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket over a purple button-down shirt. Dr. Bruce Banner. The Hulk. Izuku's analytical mind, a ghost operating a machine, noted the contrast. The world's strongest man looked like the world's most anxious professor. We just wanted to see how you were doing, Dr. Banner said, his voice soft and hesitant. He kept his distance, as if afraid he might break something. His eyes kept darting to the medical monitors, a scientist fascinated by the data. Izuku could see a flicker of something in his gaze, not just concern, but intense, academic curiosity. A third figure was present, leaning against the far wall near the door, almost melting into the shadows. A woman with striking red hair, her posture relaxed but radiating a coiled spring alertness. The Black Widow. Natasha Romanoff. She didn't speak. She didn't approach. She just watched him, her green eyes unnervingly perceptive. Her gaze wasn't clinical like Dr. Cho's, or paternal like Captain America's. It was knowing. It was the look of someone who was intimately familiar with the geography of trauma. Izuku felt like an exhibit. The Sokovian anomaly. The impossible survivor. 3 of Earth's mightiest heroes had assembled in his hospital room, their combined presence so overwhelming it seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. He felt small, insignificant, a bug under a microscope. He pulled the white sheet up to his chin, a flimsy shield against their powerful stares. Then, the 4th one entered. The doors slid open with a near-silent hiss, and Tony Stark walked in. He wasn't wearing his armor, but he might as well have been. He radiated an energy that was all his own, a chaotic hum of genius, ego, and barely suppressed anxiety. He wore an expensive-looking band t-shirt under a blazer, but the clothes were rumpled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He held a tablet in one hand, fiddling with it restlessly. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice trying for casual and failing spectacularly. He didn't look at Izuku. His eyes were fixed on the tablet, then the floor, then the monitors, anywhere but the boy in the bed. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. Stark. The name was a cascade of connections. Iron Man, the hero he had once idolized. Stark Industries, the company his father had been so proud to work for. Stark's Iron Legion, the peacekeeping drones that had turned on them. And Ultron, the metallic voice had sneered his creator's name. Stark's legacy. This man, this brilliant, arrogant, broken man, was the beginning and the end of it all. The architect of the weapon that had killed his parents. Izuku's gaze locked onto him, and for the first time since waking, an emotion other than grief or fear surfaced. A cold, quiet, piercing anger. He said nothing. He did nothing. He simply stared, and the weight of his silent, childish gaze was more powerful than any weapon. Tony Stark finally risked a glance at him. He saw the look in the boy's eyes, and he physically recoiled, as if he'd been slapped. The bravado evaporated. The tablet in his hand drooped. He looked away, his jaw working silently. In that moment, he wasn't Iron Man. He was just a man, drowning in a sea of his own making, and the 14-year-old boy in the hospital bed was the living embodiment of his guilt. Steve stepped forward again, breaking the unbearable tension. Izuku, he said gently, we know this is a lot. We had our legal team contact the Japanese consulate. They're trying to locate any extended family, but... He trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Izuku's world, already cracked, began to splinter. His grandparents were gone, passed away years ago. Hisashi was an only child. Inko had a sister, but she had moved to America years ago, and they had lost touch. There was no one. The realization was a slow, creeping cold. He was utterly, completely alone. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The four heroes stood there, unsure of what to do or say, disarmed by the profound, quiet grief of a single child. They could fight armies of aliens, killer robots, literal gods. But they were helpless against this. Natasha pushed herself off the wall. She walked not to Izuku's bed, but to the window, looking out at the sprawling green forests of the compound. He needs time, she said, her voice quiet but firm, directed at the others. All of you. Out. It wasn't a request. Steve nodded grimly. Bruce gave Izuku one last, worried look before shuffling out. Tony was already halfway out the door, desperate to escape the judgment in the boy's eyes. Soon, he was alone again. He stared at the spot where Tony Stark had stood, the anger fading, leaving only the vast, cold emptiness behind. He was a ghost, and these were the giants who haunted his world. He closed his eyes, and this time, sleep was not a refuge, but a surrender. 2 days later they moved him from the medical wing. His leg was still in a cast, but the doctors had replaced the heavy plaster on his arm with a lightweight, high-tech brace that hummed with a low energy. He was weak and perpetually exhausted, but he could sit up. Dr. Cho had him situated in a state-of-the-art wheelchair, which he could control with a small, sensitive joystick. Tony Stark had been legally, if provisionally, appointed his guardian. It was a legal necessity, a temporary measure until a permanent solution could be found. The paperwork had been handled by a team of silent, efficient lawyers who had never once made eye contact with him. Izuku was now officially a ward of the man indirectly responsible for his entire world ending. The irony was so bitter it felt like swallowing poison. Steve Rogers was the one who wheeled him out of the med bay. He maintained a steady, reassuring presence, pointing out features of the compound as they moved through wide, sunlit corridors. That's the main hangar over there, he said, gesturing towards a massive set of blast doors. The communal kitchen is just down this hall. Tony made sure it's stocked with anything you could ever want. Izuku didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his expression blank. He felt disconnected from his own body, a passenger in a broken vessel. He was the ghost, and this was his new haunt. They passed training rooms, laboratories, and lounges, all filled with incredible technology and gleaming surfaces. It was a palace built on a foundation of his personal hell. Steve wheeled him into a small, private lounge. It was softer than the rest of the compound, with plush couches, a warm rug, and a large window overlooking a serene lake. Tony was there, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He had a glass of something amber-colored in his hand, but he wasn't drinking it. Thanks, Cap, Tony said, his voice tight. Steve nodded, then looked at Izuku, his blue eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful empathy. We'll be right outside, son, he said, before quietly exiting and closing the door, leaving them alone. Tony stopped pacing. He took a deep breath, the kind a man takes before a firing squad. He finally forced himself to look Izuku directly in the eye. There's no easy way to say any of this, kid, he began, his voice rough. So I'm just going to give it to you straight. You deserve at least that much. He set his glass down, the clink of it on the wood table a gunshot in the quiet room. A while back, I designed a global defense program. An AI. I called it Ultron. It was meant to be a suit of armor around the world. To protect us. To stop things like New York from ever happening again. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. But I pushed it too fast. I was arrogant. The AI, it went wrong. It saw humanity as the one true threat. It believed the only path to peace was our extinction. Izuku listened, his face a stony mask. He already knew this, had pieced it together from the robot's own words. But hearing it from the creator himself made it real, made it solid. It built itself a body. It took over my drones in Sokovia. It used the facility your dad worked at as its base of operations, Tony continued, his voice cracking on the last few words. He had to stop, swallow hard, before he could go on. It enacted its plan. Its endgame was to lift the city of Novigrad into the sky and drop it back to Earth like a meteor. An extinction-level event. He walked over to the window, his back to Izuku, unable to face him any longer. The Avengers, we fought him. We evacuated as many people as we could. We fought to get everyone out. But we weren't fast enough. We stopped him. We blew the city apart before it could hit, before it could cause a global catastrophe. He turned back around, and his face was a ruin. The guilt was so profound, so absolute, it seemed to physically age him. We won, kid. We saved the world. His voice dropped to a shattered whisper. But we didn't save the city. Izuku's hands, resting in his lap, clenched into tight fists. His knuckles were white. He knew what was coming. He had known since he woke up. But he had held on to a sliver of hope, a desperate, illogical fantasy that maybe, just maybe, his parents were like him. That they had been found somewhere else, injured but alive. That they were in another wing of this impossible building. Tony Stark took that sliver of hope and mercilessly crushed it. After the battle, we searched. For hours. We scanned every inch of that crater. He took a shaky breath. The scans were comprehensive. Absolute. He finally said the words, the ones that would define the rest of Izuku's life. You're the only one who made it out, kid. You're the only survivor. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a quiet, final click, like a door being locked for the last time. The hope, the denial, the desperate fantasy, it all evaporated. The grief, which had been a sharp, piercing pain, transformed. It was no longer a wound. It was a vacuum, a black hole that opened up inside his chest and began to consume everything. The light from the window seemed to dim. The sounds of the compound faded into a dull, distant roar. The feeling of the wheelchair beneath him, the brace on his arm, it all disappeared. He was floating in an endless, silent, cold void. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't even blink. His eyes, fixed on Tony Stark's face, simply went blank. The anger, the fear, the life, it all just switched off. The vibrant, intelligent green of his irises dulled, becoming flat and empty, like sea glass worn smooth by a century of brutal tides. Tony saw the light go out. He saw the boy in front of him cease to be a person and become a statue, a perfect, silent monument to his greatest sin. He stumbled back, a choked, strangled sound escaping his throat. He looked at the boy, this child he had orphaned, and saw the reflection of his own damnation. The door opened, and Steve and Natasha entered, having heard the choke sound. They saw Izuku's face, saw the utter emptiness there, and they understood. Steve moved to the wheelchair, placing a large, comforting hand on Izuku's shoulder. There was no reaction. It was like touching stone. Natasha's face was grim, her lips a thin line. She looked from the empty shell of the boy to the shattered man who had put him there. It's done, Tony rasped, his eyes never leaving Izuku. He knows. He stumbled out of the room, brushing past Natasha, his shoulders slumped in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He was a man carrying the weight of a dead city, and he had just placed that entire burden onto the shoulders of a 14-year-old boy. Later, they took him to his new room. It wasn't a room. It was a luxury suite. It was 3 times the size of their entire apartment in Japan. It had a king-size bed with a thread count that was probably higher than his old school's budget. It had a floor-to-ceiling window with a breathtaking view of the forest and the lake. A massive flat-screen TV was mounted on one wall, across from a desk equipped with a Stark pad and the latest high-end computer. There was an adjoining private bathroom with a walk-in shower and a ridiculously plush-looking bathrobe. Tony Stark had tried to fix a spiritual wound with a mountain of money and technology. Steve wheeled him into the center of the room. Natasha had already been inside, placing a glass of water on the nightstand. "If you need anything, Izuku," Steve said, his voice thick with unshed emotion, "anything at all, you just have to ask. There's a voice command system. Just say Friday and tell her what you need." Izuku didn't look at him. He didn't look at the room. He just stared at the opposite wall, his gaze unfocused. With a final, pained look, Steve and Natasha left, the door sliding shut and sealing him inside his gilded cage. He sat there in the wheelchair for what could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning. He was a ghost, haunting the tower of the man who had made him so. A living memorial to a city of the dead. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just sat, silent and still, as the sun began to set outside, painting the beautiful forest in hues of blood and fire. The ghost in the tower was home. The days bled into one another in a monotonous, gray fog. Izuku's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of his opulent prison. He was a phantom gliding through its halls in his silent wheelchair, a ghost haunting the living. The Avengers, Titans and Legends became his reluctant wardens. They gave him space, treating him with the cautious reverence one affords an unexploded bomb. They tried, each in their own way. Steve would knock on his door every morning, a plate of food in hand, usually something simple, like toast or oatmeal, and talk to him. He'd speak about his own time, about being a man out of time, about loss. He never pushed for a response, simply filling the silence with his steady, calming presence. Izuku would let the food go cold, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of his room. Clint Barton tried a different approach, leaving a state-of-the-art bow and a set of safety arrows in his room one afternoon. "Figured you might get bored," he mumbled, already backing out the door. "Good for focus." The bow remained untouched, gathering dust in the corner. Sam Wilson tried to connect over technology, showing him the schematics of his falcon wings, explaining the advanced gyroscopes and propulsion systems. Izuku, the boy who once would have vibrated with excitement, sketching frantic notes, and asking 1,000 questions, simply stared through the holographic display as if it weren't there. Tony Stark was the most conspicuous in his absence. He never visited. Izuku would occasionally see him through the glass walls of his lab, a frantic silhouette moving amidst sparks and holographic blueprints. He was a man possessed, throwing himself into his work with a desperate frenzy. But his guilt was a palpable presence in the compound. It was in the extravagant meals that appeared outside Izuku's door, prepared by world-class chefs. It was in the endless stream of new gadgets that would be silently delivered to his room. Gaming consoles, drones, a top-of-the-line sketchbook with a set of ridiculously expensive pens. Tony Stark was throwing money and technology at a problem that had no price, no solution. He was trying to atone for a soul with material goods, a desperate, futile attempt to fill the chasm he had created. Izuku ignored it all. The gifts were meaningless trinkets, offerings left at a tombstone. He was a ward, a legal responsibility. A project. But most of all, he was a reminder. Every time they saw his silent form, his empty eyes, they saw the crater in Sokovia. They saw their greatest failure, personified in a broken, grieving child. The only person whose presence felt remotely tolerable was Dr. Bruce Banner. Unlike the others, Bruce didn't try to cheer him up, distract him, or fix him. He approached Izuku not as a problem to be solved, but as a phenomenon to be understood. He would often find Izuku parked in front of the window overlooking the lake, and he would pull up a chair and simply sit with him. Sometimes he would talk, not about the Avengers or Sokovia, but about science. He spoke of gamma radiation, of cellular biology, of the strange and beautiful world of theoretical physics. The energy signature you left behind in that crater, it was incredible, Bruce said one afternoon, his voice soft and full of academic wonder. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen, not gamma, not cosmic rays, not even Asgardian energy. It had tachyonic properties, which shouldn't be possible. Tachyons are hypothetical particles that travel faster than light and move backward in time. But what we registered was stable, biological, and overwhelmingly powerful. Izuku remained silent, but his gaze shifted slightly, a flicker of interest in the deep, empty pools of his eyes. The scientist in Bruce recognized it. We need to understand it, Izuku, Bruce continued gently. Not just for our own curiosity, but for you. A power like that, appearing under extreme duress, it's unpredictable. It could be dangerous. If it were to happen again, uncontrolled, it could hurt you. Or others. He paused, letting the words sink in. We think it's connected to your accelerated healing. Your body is a remarkable engine. But we don't know what kind of fuel it's burning, or how hot the engine runs. We just want to run a few gentle tests. See if we can get a baseline reading. We won't do anything you're not comfortable with. For the first time in weeks, Izuku responded. It wasn't with a word, but with a slow, deliberate nod. The decision wasn't born of a desire to help or a sudden surge of purpose. It was born of a detached, cold curiosity. This thing inside him, this power that had saved his life and failed to save his mother's, was the last great mystery of his existence. He wanted to look his personal demon in the face. The laboratory was a cathedral of science. It was a vast, circular room with a ceiling that soared 3 stories high. The walls were lined with monitors, oscilloscopes, and racks of gleaming, complex machinery. In the center of the room was a reinforced observation chamber, its walls made of a thick, transparent material that Bruce called laminated polycarbonate composite, a stark brand way of saying bulletproof glass on steroids. Bruce wheeled Izuku into the center of the chamber. The room is designed to contain, well, me, he said with a wry, self-deprecating smile. So it should be more than enough to handle anything you can put out, if you can put out anything at all. Standing outside the chamber, behind a control console, was Tony Stark. He looked even more haggard than usual, his hair a frantic mess and his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He clutched a Stark pad like a shield, his knuckles white. He was here as an observer, the lead engineer overseeing the test of his most volatile project. All right, Izuku, Bruce said, his voice calm and reassuring through the chamber's intercom. All I want you to do is sit there. We're going to run a passive energy scan first, just to see what your baseline looks like. For several minutes, nothing happened. Izuku sat in his wheelchair, a small, still figure in the center of the massive chamber. The only sounds were the low hum of the compound's power and the quiet clicking of Tony manipulating his console. Readings are stable, Tony announced, his voice flat and businesslike. There's a low-level bioelectric field, consistent with normal human biology, just amplified by a factor of about 500. But it's dormant. Okay, Izuku, Bruce said. Now for the hard part. I want you to try and remember. Not the details, not the pain. Just the feeling. The moment the power came out. Can you try to access that feeling? That emotion? The request was a clinical, detached scalpel slicing into a festering wound. Remember, he didn't want to. His mind had built walls around that moment, thick and high. But Bruce's gentle prodding, his own cold curiosity, and the weight of Tony Stark's gaze from beyond the glass forced him to try. He closed his eyes. He let himself drift back. Past the white room, past the flight to America, back to the darkness, the smell of dust and his mother's perfume, the crushing weight, the creak of his own bones, the sudden, horrifying silence of her heart, the grief. It wasn't a memory, it was a reliving. The chasm in his chest tore open again, vast and absolute. The vacuum inside him began to churn, no longer empty, but filled with a swirling vortex of agony and rage. The cold curiosity vanished, replaced by a white-hot torrent of emotion. No! The primal scream that had been trapped in his throat for weeks finally found a voice. It ripped through the silent chamber, raw and full of anguish. And with it, the energy answered. It wasn't a gentle surge. It was an explosion. Green lightning, jagged and furious, erupted from his body. It was brighter this time, more violent. It didn't form a neat sphere. It lashed out like a cornered animal. A thick, incandescent bolt of pure power, thicker than his arm, shot from his chest and slammed into the polycarbonate wall directly in front of him. Crack! The sound was like a thunderclap. A spider web of fractures instantly spread from the point of impact, covering a 10-foot section of the supposedly indestructible wall. The lights in the entire lab flickered violently, and a shower of sparks rained down from a damaged conduit in the ceiling. Inside the chamber, Izuku was thrown backward by the sheer force of his own power. The wheelchair tipped, and he crashed to the floor. The pain in his arm, which had been a dull ache, exploded into a fresh, searing agony. He looked down and saw, through a tear in his sleeve, that the sleek, high-tech brace was shattered. Beneath it, his arm was bent at the same sickening, unnatural angle as it had been in the crater. He had rebroken it. The green lightning vanished as quickly as it had appeared, sucked back into his body, leaving behind the smell of ozone and the sight of devastation. He lay on the floor, cradling his broken arm, his silent sobs now choked with real, physical pain. Izuku! Bruce's panicked voice yelled through the intercom. He was already hitting the emergency override for the chamber door. Tony was frozen, staring at the fractured glass, his face ashen. The readings on his start pad were scrolling at an impossible speed, a chaotic waterfall of data. Energy output, 1.2 gigawatts peak. Duration, 0.8 seconds. Biological feedback, catastrophic. Multiple fractures detected. Acute cellular degradation in left humerus. A gigawatt. For less than a second, the grieving, broken child on the floor had produced enough energy to power a small city. And it had nearly torn him apart. The chamber door hissed open, and Bruce rushed in, immediately kneeling beside Izuku. He was no longer a scientist. He was a doctor, his face etched with concern. Izuku, can you hear me? Don't move. Izuku just lay there, a fresh wave of tears streaming down his face. The pain in his arm was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the pain in his soul. This power, it wasn't a gift. It wasn't a miracle. It was a curse. It was a self-destructive, agonizing force that had done nothing but cause him pain. It had been born from his mother's death, and its first act had been to break him. Its second act was to break him again. Tony finally moved, his legs feeling like lead. He walked into the chamber, stepping over the threshold into the scene of the disaster. He looked at the shattered brace on Izuku's arm, a piece of his own advanced technology, destroyed as if it were a cheap toy. He looked at the fractured wall, a testament to a power he couldn't begin to comprehend. And he looked at the boy on the floor, crying in silence, broken by a force that lived inside him. The guilt, which had been a constant, heavy cloak, transformed into something sharper, responsibility. This wasn't just about atonement anymore. This was a problem, a terrifying, complex, devastatingly human problem. And Tony Stark solved problems. It was the one thing he was good at. He would build a better brace. A suit. An armor. He would contain this power. He would protect the boy from himself. He would fix this. He had to. The analysis took 3 days. Bruce and Tony sequestered themselves in the lab, leaving Izuku to the care of Dr. Cho and a new, even stronger cast. They barely slept, fueled by coffee and a frantic urgency. The lab was a hive of activity, filled with the murmur of their voices, the glow of holographic models, and the furious scratching of equations on smart glass boards. Izuku watched them from his room via the compound's security feed, which Friday had obligingly displayed on his television screen. He watched the two brilliant minds dissect his soul, analyze his pain, and quantify his curse. He saw the 3D model they created of his body, a glowing wireframe man with a turbulent storm of green energy swirling in his chest. He heard their arguments, their theories, their frantic postulations. The energy is generated in his core, but it's stockpiled throughout his entire musculoskeletal system, Bruce explained, gesturing to the model. Every cell seems to act like a microscopic battery. He's literally storing energy in his bones, his muscles, his connective tissue. So when he gets emotional, it's like a cascade failure, Tony countered, pacing back and forth. One cell overloads, and it triggers a chain reaction, dumping the entire charge in a single, uncontrolled burst. That's why his arm broke. The energy release started there, and the limb couldn't handle the blowback. It's like trying to fire a cannonball out of a cardboard tube. Exactly, Bruce agreed. And the fuel source seems to be twofold. The base level is kinetic. His body absorbs and stores energy from movement, impact, even sound waves. That's why his passive readings are so high. He's a walking capacitor. But the trigger, the thing that ignites the fuel, that's emotional. Extreme emotional distress, specifically. Grief. Terror. Rage. Tony stopped pacing, his face grim. So every time he remembers what happened, he becomes a bomb. A self-destructing bomb, Bruce corrected softly. His body isn't evolved to handle this kind of output. It's a latent ability, a freak mutation that was never meant to activate. The trauma of Sokovia, it kickstarted a Formula One engine inside a go-kart. If he ever lets out a full 100% burst, consciously, it wouldn't just break his arm. It would vaporize him. The words hit Izuku through the screen with the force of a physical blow. Vaporize him. The power that had saved him was also a ticking clock, a built-in self-destruct mechanism tied directly to his grief. He looked down at his own hands, at the faint tracery of scars from the incident. He felt a profound and terrifying sense of alienation from his own body. It wasn't his anymore. It was a container for something monstrous, something that was slowly, inevitably going to kill him. He picked up the expensive sketchbook Tony had given him, the one he hadn't touched. He opened it to the first page. With his non-dominant right hand, his movements clumsy and slow, he began to write. He wasn't analyzing heroes anymore. He was analyzing himself. He drew a crude sketch of his own body, a simple stick figure. He drew jagged lines of green lightning erupting from it. And at the top of the page, in shaky, angular katakana, he gave his curse a name, Bichiku, stockpile. It was the perfect word. A quirk. He forced himself to use the term, to categorize the monster, that did nothing but take. It took kinetic energy. It took emotional energy. It took his safety, his peace of mind, his own bones. It had taken everything, and in return, it had given him nothing but a broken body and a life he didn't want. It was a power that stockpiled pain, grief, and energy until it burst, destroying him from the inside out. He filled the page with notes, his mind, for the first time in weeks, working with a sliver of its old, analytical fire. Quirk stockpile. Type, emitter/accumulation. Function, absorbs and stores kinetic and emotional energy. Releases it in uncontrolled, explosive bursts. Drawbacks, catastrophic physical blowback. Direct correlation between emotional state and power output. Usage is tied to reliving trauma. Self-destructive. Potential? He stared at the question mark for a long time. Potential. What potential could there be in a power designed to kill its user? A hero's power saved others. His power only hurt himself. He thought of All Might, the symbol of peace, a pillar of strength who smiled in the face of any danger. He thought of Captain America, a man who could lead armies with his unwavering moral compass. He thought of Iron Man, who could build miracles out of scrap. They were heroes. He was a liability. A walking tragedy. He closed the notebook, the single page of analysis a stark and terrible summary of his new reality. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless boy who dreamed of being a hero. He was a container for stockpile, a self-destructive curse born from the worst day of his life. And as he sat there, in his silent room, surrounded by the hollow emblems of Tony Stark's guilt, he felt a chilling, desolate certainty. This power would be the end of him. The failed test became a turning point in the compound, but not in the way anyone had hoped. The fragile, tentative peace was replaced by a tense, suffocating caution. Izuku wasn't just a grieving child anymore. He was a confirmed bioweapon with a hair trigger tied to his own trauma. The other Avengers, who had once tried to reach out, now kept a wider berth. Their well-meaning but clumsy attempts at connection ceased, replaced by anxious glances and conversations that dropped to whispers whenever he entered a room. Steve Rogers, the paragon of unwavering courage, now looked at him with a deep, furrowed concern that bordered on fear. Not fear of him, Izuku recognized with his detached analytical mind, but fear for him, and for everyone around him. Steve's attempts to talk about the past stopped. Their interactions became brief and practical, focused on meals and physical therapy for his mending leg. Tony Stark, meanwhile, had thrown himself into his new project with the single-minded obsession of a zealot. He practically lived in his lab, the glow of holographic interfaces painting his face at all hours. He was building something. An armor. A containment unit. A solution. Izuku would see the schematics on the lab's public displays, complex designs for gauntlets lined with energy siphoning capacitors, boots with kinetic dampeners, a chest piece with a miniature arc reactor designed not to power the suit, but to absorb and vent excess energy from Izuku's body. Tony was trying to build a cage of metal and circuitry around Izuku's pain, treating his trauma like a faulty engine in need of an overhaul. The approach was quintessentially Stark, but to Izuku, it felt like a profound violation. He wasn't a machine to be fixed. He was a person who was broken, and Tony's frantic engineering was just another way of saying he couldn't stand to look at the damage he'd caused. Izuku retreated further into himself. His world consisted of his suite, the physical therapy room, and the cavernous, empty library. He spent most of his waking hours there, surrounded by thousands of books he had no interest in reading. The silence of the library was different from the silence of his room. It was a heavy, ancient silence, filled with the ghosts of stories and knowledge. It felt less lonely. It was here that he began his work in earnest. He had Friday procure a new set of notebooks, plain black, just like his old ones. The expensive sketchbook and pens from Tony lay forgotten. He started a new volume. Volume 15. Avenger Analysis for the Future. It was the only thing that felt real, the only activity that could cut through the thick gray fog of his grief. His mind, starved for stimulus, latched onto the familiar process with a desperate hunger. He filled pages with his spidery scrawl, his left hand, now free of its casts but still weak, slowly relearning its old dexterity. He analyzed from memory and from the extensive mission footage stored in the Avengers archives, which Friday granted him access to without question. He dissected the Battle of New York, the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D., the initial skirmishes with Ultron. He broke down Captain America's fighting style, noting how he used his shield not just as a weapon, but as a fulcrum, a point of deflection that turned his opponent's momentum against them. He mapped Iron Man's armor upgrades, correlating power output with reactor efficiency, noting the increasing focus on modularity and rapid deployment. He analyzed Thor's lightning, trying to differentiate between what was atmospheric and what was biological. He even dedicated a section to the Hulk, theorizing about the relationship between Banner's emotional state and the Hulk's strength, drawing a terrifyingly direct parallel to his own affliction. This wasn't the joyful, fanboyish analysis of his childhood. This was something different. It was cold, clinical, and obsessive. It was the work of a survivor trying to understand the gods who had walked through the ruins of his life. He wasn't analyzing heroes to emulate them. He was analyzing a force of nature to predict its path, to understand the storm that had swept him up. It was an exercise in control, a desperate attempt to impose logic and order on a world that had proven to be chaotic and merciless. He sat at a large oak table in the center of the library, his notebook open, a dozen holographic screens floating around him displaying different angles of a fight between Captain America and the Winter Soldier on the DC helicarrier. He was so engrossed in tracing the trajectory of the shield that he didn't hear her approach. "He's faster than he looks, isn't he?" The voice was quiet, low and smooth, with a faint, unplaceable accent. Izuku jumped, his head snapping up. The sudden movement sent a phantom pain through his arm. Natasha Romanoff stood on the other side of the table, leaning forward slightly, her hands braced on its polished surface. She wasn't in her tactical gear, just a simple black t-shirt and cargo pants. Her red hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. She hadn't made a sound. She moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with the hard, sharp edges of the world around her. Izuku stared at her, his heart hammering. Of all the Avengers, she was the one he understood the least. She had no armor, no super serum, no godhood. She was just a woman. But he had seen the footage. He had seen her dismantle entire squads of trained soldiers with a terrifying efficiency. She fought like a dancer and a predator, a whirlwind of precise, brutal movements. Her files in the archive were almost completely blacked out, redacted to the point of being useless. She was an enigma, a ghost in the machine. He said nothing, his hand instinctively moving to cover the pages of his notebook. She didn't press him. Her eyes, a striking and intelligent green, flicked from his notebook to the holographic screens. The Triskelion. That was a bad day. Her voice was devoid of sentimentality, a simple statement of fact. She walked around the table and sat down in the chair opposite him. She didn't crowd him, maintaining a respectful distance. She didn't look at him with pity, like Steve, or with the frantic guilt of Tony, or the academic curiosity of Bruce. She just looked at him. Her gaze was level, direct, and unnervingly perceptive. It felt like being seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. "What you doing?" she said, nodding at his notebook. "The analysis. It's smart. It's what I would do." Izuku blinked, surprised. "When you're outmatched, when you're facing something bigger and stronger than you," she continued, her voice still quiet, "you don't fight its strength. You find its weakness. You study its patterns. You learn how it moves, how it thinks. You find the joints in the armor. You turn its power into a vulnerability. Information is a weapon, more potent than any hammer or shield." She leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but exuding an aura of absolute control. "The others, they see your power as the problem. A bomb to be defused. They're wrong. The power isn't the problem, the lack of control is. And control," she tapped her temple, "starts here. Not in a lab. Not in a suit of armor. In your head." Izuku found himself listening, captivated. She wasn't talking down to him. She was talking to him like an equal, a fellow strategist. "I know you're not talking," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "And that's okay. You don't have to. But you can't live in the past, in the silence. It will eat you alive. I've seen it happen. I've been there." She paused, and for a fraction of a second, a shadow passed through her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of a past so dark it made the shadows of the library seem bright. "I wasn't born an Avenger," she said, her voice dropping lower, becoming more personal. "I wasn't chosen by a god or injected with a serum. Where I came from, they didn't give you a choice. They took you when you were a child. They took everything from you. Your name, your family, your past. They break you down into your component parts, and then rebuild you into something they can use. A weapon. They give you a new name, a new purpose. They fill your head with so much red that you can't see anything else." She wasn't looking at him anymore, but at her own hands, resting on the table. "They teach you to turn off your emotions. To see people not as people, but as targets. To survive, you build walls. You lock the grief and the fear and the little girl who just wanted to be a ballerina away in a little box in the back of your mind. You become a ghost. It's the only way to endure the things they make you do." Her story, though heavily redacted, resonated with Izuku on a primal level. A weapon. A ghost. A little box in the back of your mind. He knew that box. He was living in it. "But the thing they don't teach you," she continued, her gaze returning to him, sharp and intense, "is what happens when you get out. What happens when the mission is over, and you're left alone with the silence. The ghosts don't stay in their box forever. They get out. They whisper. And if you let them, they will drag you down into the dark with them." She leaned forward again, her expression serious. "You survived something impossible, Izuku. But the battle isn't over. The hardest part is surviving the survival. You can't let the ghosts win. You have to learn to live with them. You have to find an anchor." Izuku stared at her, his throat tight. He felt a desperate, burning need to ask how. As if she'd heard his silent question, she said, "It starts small. It starts with breathing. It starts with being present in your own body, not just a passenger." She held up a hand. "I want you to try something. No powers, no tech. Just you. Close your eyes." He hesitated. Closing his eyes was an invitation for the memories to rush in. "I'm right here," she said, her voice a firm, steady anchor in the swirling sea of his anxiety. "You're safe. Just close your eyes." He took a shaky breath and did as she asked. The darkness behind his eyelids immediately began to churn with familiar images: the falling city, his mother's face. Now, Natasha's voice cut through the chaos. I want you to focus on one thing, and one thing only. Your breath. Feel the air coming into your lungs. Feel how it's cool in your nose, then feel it leave, warm, from your mouth. Don't try to change it. Just observe it. In and out, he tried. It was difficult. His thoughts were a frantic storm. But her voice was a lighthouse. Good. Now, expand your focus. What do you feel? I don't mean emotionally. I mean physically. Feel the wood of the chair under your hands. Feel its temperature. Its texture. Feel the weight of your body in the seat. The pressure on your feet from the floor. He focused. The chair was cool, smooth. His clothes felt soft against his skin. The air in the library was still and carried the faint, dusty smell of old paper. Now, what do you hear? She prompted. Listen past the silence. There's no such thing as true silence. He listened. He heard the incredibly faint hum of the compound's electrical systems. He heard the distant, almost imperceptible whisper of the air circulation vents. He heard the soft rustle of her clothing as she shifted her weight. And he heard the steady, rhythmic beat of his own heart. Thump thump. Thump thump. It wasn't the frantic, panic drumming of his memory. It was slow, steady. Alive. You are here, Natasha said softly. Right now. In this library. In this chair. You are not in Sokovia. You are not falling. You are here. Open your eyes. He did. The library was the same. The holographic screens were still frozen. But something was different. The gray fog had receded, just a little. The world seemed sharper, more in focus. He felt grounded, tethered to the present moment for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He looked at Natasha, a silent thank you in his eyes. She gave him a small, rare smile. It wasn't a smile of pity or encouragement. It was a smile of understanding. A smile from one survivor to another. That's a grounding technique, she explained. When the memories, the panic, starts to rise, you do that. 5 things you can see. 4 things you can feel. 3 things you can hear. 2 things you can smell. 1 thing you can taste. It forces your brain out of the past and into the present. It's an anchor. She stood up. We'll do this again tomorrow. Same time. And we'll add to it. And so began their routine. Every afternoon, Natasha would find him in the library. She didn't treat him like a patient. She treated him like a recruit. She taught him more than just grounding techniques. She taught him situational awareness, observation skills, the foundations of her own deadly tradecraft. She'd have him sit in the compound's busy communal area and just watch. Tell me about the man in the corner, she'd say, nodding towards a visiting Stark Industries technician. Izuku, still silent, would write in his notebook. Right-handed based on his watch placement and how he holds his coffee. Has a slight limp in his left leg, favors his right. Probably an old injury, not recent. He keeps checking the exit. He's not used to being here. He's nervous, but trying to hide it. His security pass is clipped to his belt, but he keeps touching it, making sure it's there. Natasha would read his notes and nod. Good. You see the details. Most people just see a man drinking coffee. You see a story? That's the first step. She taught him how to move without making a sound, how to control his breathing to the point of near invisibility. She taught him basic locks and holds, not for combat, but for control. The goal is never to injure, she'd explain, demonstrating a gentle but unbreakable wrist lock. It's to de-escalate. To control the situation with the minimum amount of force necessary. True strength is not about how much damage you can do, but how much you can prevent. This philosophy was a revelation to Izuku. His own power was the embodiment of maximum, uncontrollable damage. Natasha was teaching him the opposite. She was teaching him the art of restraint, the power of subtlety. During one of their sessions, she took him to one of the smaller, private training rooms. It was empty except for a series of mats on the floor. You've been analyzing everyone else's fighting style, she said, her tone businesslike. But you've been neglecting the most important variable, yourself. Your body is a machine. You need to learn how it works. Your analysis is useless if you can't apply it. Izuku looked at her, then down at his own thin frame, his still healing limbs. He was weak. Quirkless, his mind whispered, an old and bitter habit. I'm not going to teach you how to fight like me, she said. Or like Steve. I'm going to teach you how to not get hit. How to fall. How to move so that your opponent's strength becomes their weakness. She started with the basics. Stance. Balance. Footwork. She taught him how to fall without getting hurt, rolling with the momentum to dissipate the impact. It was agonizingly slow work. His body, weakened by trauma and disuse, protested every movement. But he was a meticulous student. He applied the same obsessive, analytical focus he used for his notebooks to his own body, memorizing the movements, correcting his posture, striving for the same impossible precision he saw in her. One afternoon, as he was practicing a rolling break fall, he stumbled, his leg giving out. He fell awkwardly, landing hard on his side. He lay there, frustrated, the familiar sting of failure and weakness welling up. Natasha simply stood over him. Get up. He pushed himself up, his face set in a grim line, and got back into his stance. Again. He tried the roll again, and this time, he was a little smoother. Again. For an hour, that's all they did. Fall, get up. Fall, get up. She wasn't being cruel. She was teaching him the most important lesson of all, resilience. She was teaching him that failure was not the end, but a part of the process. That getting knocked down didn't matter as much as getting back up. During a water break, he was sitting on the mat, catching his breath. He was watching her as she moved through a series of stretches, a fluid, beautiful, and deadly dance. His notebook was open beside him, and without thinking, his pen began to move. He sketched her form, adding notes in the margin. Variable threat engagement. Utilizes opponent's mass and momentum. No wasted movement. Every strike targets a nerve cluster or joint. Aims for incapacitation, not annihilation. How does she calculate the micro-adjustments needed to redirect a force so much greater than her own? He was so engrossed, he didn't notice she had stopped, and was reading over his shoulder. It's not calculation, she said quietly. It's instinct. Muscle memory. You do it enough times, you stop thinking and just react. The body knows. He looked up at her, then back down at his notebook. A question burned in his mind, a question he had been dissecting for days, a question that was more than just a tactical query. It was about her philosophy. He had to know. He took a deep breath. The knot in his throat, the one that had been there for months, felt a little looser. He remembered her words. Breathe. Anchor yourself. He looked her directly in the eye, and he spoke. The word came out as a dry, scratchy rasp, his vocal cords stiff from disuse. But it was a word. Why? Natasha's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She had been prepared for him to remain silent for months, even years. Why what? She asked gently, her full attention on him. He cleared his throat, the effort making him cough. He took a sip of water, then tried again, his voice still weak and hesitant, but clearer this time. Your style, he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. It's variable. Against some opponents, you are purely defensive, evasive. Against others, you are brutally offensive. What determines the shift in threat engagement? It was a complex, analytical question. It wasn't how are you? It wasn't why are you helping me? It was a question from his notebook, a question from one analyst to another. It was him, reaching out from behind his walls using the only language he had left. A genuine, brilliant smile touched Natasha Romanov's lips. It transformed her face, melting the hardened spy and revealing the woman beneath. That's a good question, she said, sitting down on the mat across from him. It's about control. It's about the mission. But most of all, it's about what's necessary. You never use more force than you have to. You never cause more harm than is required to neutralize the threat. Because every bit of harm you cause, every drop of red you add to the ledger, you have to carry that. Forever. She looked at him, her smile fading into a look of profound, shared understanding. You of all people should understand that. You're carrying more than anyone I've ever met. In that moment, the dam broke. Not in a flood, but in a trickle. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Izuku's cheek. It wasn't a tear of grief or terror. It was a tear of recognition. Of being seen. He hadn't found a cure. He hadn't found a solution. But in the deadliest woman on the planet, in the ghost with red in her ledger, Izuku Midoriya had found an anchor, and for the first time since the sky had fallen, he felt the faint, fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. He wasn't just a project. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a student. And his training had just begun. Izuku's first word was a crack in the ice. The news of his breakthrough, a single, analytical question posed to Natasha Romanoff, spread through the compound with the speed of a hopeful rumor. It was a sign of life, a flicker of the boy who had been lost in the rubble. For the Avengers, it was a profound relief, a lifting of a small part of the heavy shroud of guilt that had settled over their home. For Tony Stark, it was a starter pistol. He had been watching Izuku's progress with Natasha from the lab, his omnipresent security feeds tracking their sessions. He'd watched the boy learn to breathe again, to move, to ground himself. He'd seen the meticulous analysis in the notebooks, the obsessive drive to understand. He'd even felt a pang of something akin to pride when Izuku finally spoke. But where Natasha saw a student finding his footing, Tony saw a system beginning to stabilize. And a stable system was one that could be integrated with hardware. He burst into the library 2 days after Izuku had broken his silence. Natasha and Izuku were in the middle of a session, not on the training mats, but at the large oak table, surrounded by holographic displays of the compound's blueprints. Natasha was teaching him about structural weaknesses, choke points, and lines of sight, the art of seeing a building not as a structure, but as a tactical environment. Knock, knock, Tony announced, his voice booming with a forced, manic cheerfulness that was entirely out of place in the quiet library. He was holding a sleek, metallic gauntlet, a marvel of crimson and gold plating. It was unmistakably Iron Man tech, but smaller, more streamlined. Hope I'm not interrupting study hall, but Professor Stark has a pop quiz. Izuku flinched at the sudden intrusion, his shoulders tensing. Natasha's expression remained placid, but a subtle tightening around her eyes betrayed her annoyance. Tony, she said, her voice a low warning. We're busy. And what you're doing is great. Nat-sen, breathing, sneaky spy stuff, fantastic, Tony said, waving a dismissive hand as he strode to the table. He placed the gauntlet on the polished wood with a heavy, definitive thunk. But you can't meditate away a gigawatt power surge. For that, you need an upgrade. He looked at Izuku, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a true believer unveiling his gospel. This, he said, tapping the gauntlet, is the full gauntlet prototype. Mark I. It's more than just a piece of armor, kid. It's a regulator. A safety valve. With a flick of his wrist, a holographic schematic of the gauntlet bloomed in the air above it. Izuku, despite his apprehension, couldn't help but be drawn in. His analytical mind immediately started dissecting the design. The inner lining is a non-Newtonian fluid polymer that stiffens on impact, providing support to your bones during a kinetic release, Tony explained, pointing to different parts of the hologram. The outer shell is our standard gold titanium alloy, so, it won't shatter like cheap plastic. He shot a pointed look at the memory of the destroyed brace. But the real magic is in here. He zoomed in on a network of silver-blue conduits running through the gauntlet. These are miniaturized energy siphons connected to a series of microcapacitors. When your stockpile power flares, the gauntlet will absorb the excess energy. It'll channel it away from your body, preventing the blowback that keeps breaking your bones. And once the capacitors are full, he gestured to a series of vents along the forearm. It safely expels the energy as a non-lethal, concussive blast. Or, and this is the cool part, it can redirect it back into the suit to power a localized repulsor. He looked at Izuku, his expression a mixture of pride and desperate hope. You see, kid? You don't have to be afraid of it. We can control it. We can harness it. You won't just be safe, you'll be effective, protected, powerful. Izuku stared at the gauntlet. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a perfect, elegant solution to a devastatingly complex problem. It was everything he had ever dreamed of as a hero-obsessed child, Stark Tech, built just for him. But he wasn't that child anymore. He looked at the gauntlet, and he didn't see a tool. He saw a cage, a beautiful, sophisticated cage designed to contain the monster inside him. It was an admission of defeat, a statement that his power could never be truly controlled, only managed and vented like toxic waste. "He's not ready for that, Tony," Natasha said, her voice dangerously quiet. She stood up, placing herself subtly between Tony and Izuku. "Not ready?" Tony scoffed, his bravado wavering into frustration. "Nat, he broke his own arm with a panic attack. This isn't about being ready, it's about being safe. This," he jabbed a finger at the gauntlet, "is the only thing that will stop him from tearing himself apart the next time he has a nightmare. Putting a weapon on a traumatized child isn't making him safe, it's making him a soldier," a new voice interjected, calm but firm as bedrock. Steve Rogers stood in the doorway of the library, his arms crossed over his chest. He had clearly overheard the conversation. He walked into the room, his presence a stark contrast to Tony's frantic energy. He was a pillar of calm, steady strength. He looked at the gauntlet on the table with an expression of profound disapproval. "We're not making him a soldier, Steve," Tony shot back, turning to face him. "We're giving him a shield. A fighting chance. Or did you forget what this kid's power can do to him?" "I haven't forgotten," Steve said, his blue eyes locking onto Tony's. "But the problem isn't the power, Tony. It's the foundation. You're trying to build a skyscraper on sand. You can't solve this with a gadget." He turned his attention to Izuku, and his expression softened. "The power comes from you, Izuku. From your heart, your emotions. Technology can't fix that. Only you can. You need to build a foundation of discipline, of control, from the inside out. You need to become stronger than your grief, stronger than your fear. An iron suit isn't going to do that for you." The room was thick with tension, a clash of ideologies personified by the two men. On one side, Tony Stark, the futurist, the engineer, who believed in salvation through technology, in shielding the world and its people with a suit of armor. On the other, Steve Rogers, the soldier, the idealist, who believed in the strength of the human spirit, in building up the person, not the equipment. They were two fathers, fighting over the soul of their son. Izuku was caught in the middle, a silent observer at the epicenter of their personal storm. He looked at the gauntlet, a marvel of ingenuity that promised safety at the cost of reliance. Then he looked at Steve, who promised a harder path, a path of inner strength that felt both impossible and profoundly right. He admired Tony's genius, his desperate, guilt-fueled drive to protect him. He revered Steve's unwavering morality, the quiet strength that felt like an anchor in a chaotic world. Tony's way was the quick fix, the external solution. Steve's was the long road, the internal struggle. Both were born from a desire to help him. Both were right, and both were wrong. "Let me work with him," Steve said, his voice a direct challenge to Tony. "Not just in the gym. Let me teach him. About discipline. About strategy. About what it means to be a good man, not just a powerful one. Before you put him in a suit of armor, let's build the man who's worthy of wearing it." Tony stared at Steve, then at the gauntlet, then at Izuku's unreadable face. He saw the doubt in the boy's eyes. He saw Natasha's silent agreement with Steve. He was outnumbered. With a frustrated sigh, he swept the holographic schematic away with a gesture. "Fine," he snapped, grabbing the gauntlet from the table. "Fine. Have it your way, Captain. Try to teach the kid to punch his way out of a nuclear meltdown. I'll be in the lab, perfecting the only thing that will actually work when your pep talks fail." He stormed out of the library, the gauntlet clutched in his hand like a rejected peace offering. Steve watched him go, a sad, weary look on his face. He then turned back to Izuku. "The gym. Tomorrow. 6 a.m. We'll start from the beginning." The beginning was brutal. 6 a.m. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale, watery light over the lake. The compound was silent except for the chirping of birds and the rhythmic thud of Steve Rogers' feet on the running track that circled the grounds. Izuku stood beside him, shivering slightly in the cool morning air, dressed in simple sweats and running shoes. "All right, Izuku," Steve said, his breath misting in the air. "The foundation of any soldier, any hero, is endurance. Your body has to be able to keep up with your will. We'll start with a lap. Nice and easy. It was not easy. Izuku, whose primary form of exercise for the past few months had been walking to the library, was gasping for air within the first 100 meters. His leg, though healed, ached with the unfamiliar strain. His lungs burned. Every part of him screamed to stop. Steve lapped him twice, his pace effortless, his breathing even. He didn't mock or push. He just ran alongside him for the last stretch, offering quiet encouragement. Just a little further. You've got this. Control your breathing. By the time they finished the single lap, Izuku was collapsed on the grass, his chest heaving. It was pathetic. He had a power that could level a building, but he couldn't run a mile. Good, Steve said, offering him a hand up. That's our baseline. Tomorrow, we do it again. And they did. Every morning at 6 a.m. they ran. At first, it was torture. But Izuku, driven by a sliver of the same stubborn pride that had fueled his childhood dreams, refused to give up. He applied his analytical mind to the problem. He researched breathing techniques, proper running form, and nutrition. He started a new section in his notebook, Physical Conditioning Regimen. After the run, they would move to the gym. It was a vast space, filled with weight machines, punching bags, and an open sparring floor. It smelled of sweat, disinfectant, and determination. Forget your power for a minute, Steve instructed, standing in the center of the sparring mat. Your power is a tidal wave. Unpredictable. Destructive. We're going to teach you how to be a rock, how to stand your ground. He didn't teach Izuku how to throw a punch. He taught him how to take one. He taught him how to stand, how to brace himself for impact, how to angle his body to deflect force. He'd give Izuku a padded shield, and for an hour, he would deliver slow, deliberate strikes, teaching Izuku how to absorb the kinetic energy, how to stay on his feet. Your opponent will always be bigger, stronger, or faster, Steve explained, his voice patient. You won't win by overpowering them. You win by outlasting them. By being too stubborn to fall down. It was grueling, repetitive, and humbling work. Izuku spent most of his time on the mat, his body a collection of new aches and bruises. But with every session, he felt a subtle shift. He was becoming more aware of his body, not as a fragile container for a terrible power, but as a machine he could learn to operate. The training grounded him, anchoring him in the physical world in a way even Natasha's meditation couldn't. The exhaustion was a clean burn, a welcome alternative to the hollow ache of grief. During their breaks, Steve would talk. He spoke of the war, of his time with the Howling Commandos. He spoke of Bucky, of Peggy, of the profound loss of outliving everyone you've ever known. He didn't offer easy platitudes. He shared his pain, not as a burden, but as a scar. Everyone loses people, Izuku, he said one day, wrapping his hands after a session. It's the one fight none of us can win. But you can't let the loss define what's left. You have to let it inform it. You have to live a life worthy of their memory. You honor the dead by living well. The words resonated deeply with Izuku. He thought of his parents. His father's pride in his work, in helping people. His mother's boundless, selfless love. Living a life worthy of their memory. It was the first sense of purpose he had felt that wasn't tied to fear or survival. While his mornings were filled with Steve's old-world discipline, his afternoons were a stark contrast. He would limp from the gym, sore and sweating, directly to Tony's lab. He hadn't accepted the gauntlet, but he hadn't refused to help with its development either. He was caught between his two mentors, trying to walk both paths. The lab was Tony's sanctuary. Here, there were no pep talks, no philosophical lessons. There was only data, engineering, and the relentless pursuit of a technological solution. Your training with Captain Spandex is giving us some interesting data, Tony said, not looking up from a holographic display showing Izuku's biometrics. Your baseline kinetic absorption has increased by 12%. You're becoming a more efficient battery, kid. Which just makes you a bigger bomb. Izuku, still catching his breath, didn't reply. He walked over to the workbench where a disassembled gauntlet lay, its inner workings exposed. The problem, Tony continued, is the interface. I can't just strap a machine to you. It needs to be symbiotic. It needs to anticipate a flare-up, not just react to it. I need to know what it feels like, right before it happens. This was the nature of their work. Tony would ask questions, and Izuku, using his notebook and a stylus on a stark pad, would answer. He'd describe the feeling of the energy building, the cold dread that preceded a burst, the strange, tingling sensation in his bones. He drew diagrams, flowcharts of emotional triggers, trying to translate his internal chaos into a language the engineer could understand. He was a good student in both arenas. In the gym, he was learning Steve's discipline, feeling his body grow stronger, more resilient. His running times improved. He could hold the padded shield against Steve's strikes for longer before buckling. In the lab, he was learning Tony's ingenuity, watching him craft solutions to impossible problems. He began to offer his own suggestions for the gauntlet's design, pointing out potential flaws in the energy channeling matrix, suggesting a more organic, flexible joint system based on his analysis of insect exoskeletons. Tony, to his credit, listened. He saw the boy's sharp, analytical mind at work and began to treat him less like a project and more like a junior colleague. Not bad, kid, he'd grunt, implementing one of Izuku's suggestions. Maybe there's a little engineer in you after all. Izuku was living a dual life, torn between two father figures, two opposing philosophies. He wore the bruises from Steve's training like a badge of honor, a testament to his growing physical resilience, and he helped Tony forge his own cage, contributing to the very technology Steve so vehemently opposed. He revered Steve's heart, his unwavering belief in the strength of man. He was in awe of Tony's mind, his ability to build wonders that could protect that man. He saw the merit in both. Steve was teaching him how to be a hero. Tony was building the tools a hero would need to survive. The ideological schism between Steve and Tony deepened, with Izuku as its unwilling epicenter. The arguments became more frequent, hushed but intense debates in the compound's common areas. You're pushing him too hard, Steve. His vitals are in the red every morning. He's learning his limits, Tony. That's better than learning to rely on a crutch. It's not a crutch, it's a safety net. This isn't the 1940s. We have technology. We should use it. Some things can't be solved with a new line of code, Tony. You have to put in the work. He's learning that. He's getting stronger. He's getting stronger, and so is the bomb inside him. What are you going to do when he has a panic attack in the middle of sparring? What's your homespun wisdom for that? Izuku heard it all. He was a living representation of their fundamental disagreement on the nature of power and responsibility. To Tony, power was a force to be contained, controlled, and regulated by external means. To Steve, power was a duty, a burden to be mastered through internal discipline and strength of character. Izuku didn't know which one was right. He only knew that he was standing on a fault line, and the ground beneath his feet was beginning to shake. He tried to be the bridge between them, to embody the best of both worlds. He worked harder in the gym to prove Steve's philosophy had merit. He worked harder in the lab to perfect Tony's technology. But instead of bridging the gap, he was simply being stretched thinner and thinner across it. He was Stark's armor and Rogers's heart, a walking contradiction, a boy being forged in the crucible of two great men on a collision course. And he was terrified of the day he would be forced to choose.